Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our CentOS installation, and specifically, we are going to look at our CentOS server that currently hosts an Apache web server. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on Oracle VirtualBox and private virtual networking. The idea here is that I want to be able to host an Apache web server and be able to access it from a private network. Now, in an earlier video, I showed you how to install your Apache web server and also have your client connect to your Apache web server. And in both cases, the Apache web server was accessed by the statically defined IP address, the one that you would find if you simply ran ifconfig on your server. And in this particular case, you'll see that I have a total of 3 adapters, my NAT adapter, my second adapter, which I have added, which has the 192.168.2.100 IP address, and then my local loopback adapter. And in both cases, for the local loopback adapter, as well as for the statically defined IP address, I can, in fact, get to the web server. Now, the downside is I have to remember the IP address, or I have to always open up the console and verify what it is. That also means that your clients have to know what the IP address is. What we'd like to do is show you how now to utilize the machine name in a scenario where you are not necessarily using DNS. In other words, this is not meant to be a public-facing website. If anything, this is just for convenience on a private network so that you do not have to remember the IP address. So we're going to do a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to set the local machine name. I'm going to actually go about doing that through the UI. You can also do that through the console. And then the second thing that I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to modify the host file so that you can then access the website from your web browser using the name. So let's go ahead and get started real quick. We'll go to our system settings. And you'll notice that down here at the bottom, under the About, we have the ability to modify the device name. And by default, it is simply localhost. As a matter of fact, you can verify this by coming over to your terminal. And you can simply ping localhost, and localhost will respond with the IPv6 address. And we can also technically come to our web browser, and you'll see that we again will get our web server. In this case, we'll get that default page that we set up in an earlier video. Now, localhost will not work on a remote computer, because if you were to run that on a remote computer, whether it be a virtual machine or a physical computer, it is essentially going to look to itself instead of to this server, the 192.168.2.100 in my case. So how do we fix this? Well, the first thing that we want to do is we want to go about creating a better name for this device. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to use the name that I gave it for the purposes of Oracle VirtualBox. In other words, I'm going to call this one server -01, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a fully qualified domain name that also uses my initials, so GCM, and then I'm just going to add then a top-level domain of local. Again, it doesn't really matter too much what you use here, as long as you don't use something that's going to conflict with a resource that is publicly available. In other words, you don't want to, for instance, use a name for another site, maybe an edu site or even a .com site. So in this case, I'm just going to indicate that this is meant for a local or private network. And at this point, we can just simply rename it. You can then come out here to your console, and you can actually look using the host name function that you could see that you have, in fact, been able to successfully rename it. If you pull up the help for the host name functionality, you can actually see that you've got a number of possibilities here. You can see what the alias names are and so on. And what we want to do then is we simply want to ping the server-01.gcm.local, and we'll see that it says name or service not known. Now, we can also try to simply ping the host name. Let's do this in 2 steps here. We'll say host name first. And very carefully, we can either type this or copy it. We can attempt to ping this. And you can see that we can, in fact, get to it one way, but not the other way. In other words, basically, we can't get to it with that more friendly name. We can, though, however, now come up here, and instead of having local, we can simply put in then server-01-gcm-local. And you'll see that, in fact, I'm not able to get to the local machine, even if I prefix this with http://. So again, does not appear to be working correctly, not like it did with localhost. And we're back to having to use an IP address. Now you'll notice here also that I am getting a reply from something other than my local machine. And so I'm not getting my 192.168.2.100. So something's not right. Well, let's fix this. And the way that we fix this is we now want to modify the host file that indicate that this device name in either iteration, we are going to focus on this name, map it to the IP address, and then it can be resolved. And so the way that we go about doing this is we essentially look first for the host file. So we're going to cd to our etc directory, do an ls-l, and you'll see that there is a hosts file right here. Notice it is not a folder. And then we can use our favorite text editor. In this case, I'm going to use Nano for a little bit of variety to open and read and then ultimately modify our hosts file. And you can see that in our host file is where we have been defining the IP address 127.0.0.1 mapping to localhost, localhost.local domain, and a couple of different incarnations. And you can see here that it's local domain 4 for the IPv4, as well as 6 for the IPv6. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to add a couple of entries in here so that we could get to our website in a couple of different ways. And we'll start off first by putting in the IP address, the 192.168.2.100. In other words, whatever IP address you have for your server, followed by whatever incarnations of that server name you wish to respond. So in this case, I'm going to start off with server-01. I'm going to also want it to respond to server-01.gcm. And lastly, server-01.gcm.local. Now, we go ahead and try to get out of Nano by hitting Control X. Do we, in fact, wish to save this file? The answer is yes. It tells us that we have been able to, or are asking us rather, to write to the host file, and we hit enter. You can go back and rerun Nano just to verify that your changes are in fact in place. And then we can again go ahead and exit out. But now when you come over to our browser, let's just open a new tab here and let's see how many different ways we can in fact now access our web server. And so we'll start off with server not -1-GCM, but we're going to go with .gcm.local. And you can see that now, in fact, it recognizes it. It maps it correctly to the 192.168.2.100. I can also simply type in server-01. And specifically in this case, I will want to put in http://server-01. If not, Google will try, or Firefox will rather send it to a search engine. And then for the third example, real quick, we can see if we can access it by server-01.gcm without the local. And sure enough, we can now access it any way that we have entered in that host file. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to bring up our client. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into another virtual machine on my virtual network. I'm going to attempt to split the screen. And I'm going to show you the problem with our networking. In other words, right now, if we were to try to access localhost on this virtual machine, in other words, on the second virtual machine, it is essentially going to be looking to itself, and the client does not have a web server installed on it. If we try to ping localhost, well, that'll work, but of course, it's going to be pinging itself, and it's going to get a response. And more importantly, if it tries to ping something like server-01.gcm.local, it won't find it. It also won't find any incarnation. So we have our server-01.gcm, and in this case, it seems like I'm conflicting with some other name on the internet, actually getting a response back. That is clearly not me. But at this point, you can see the problem. Fundamentally, we can't get from our client to our server using our friendly name. We can, however, still get to it using the 192.168.2.100. In other words, the IP address that I remember as being for the server. Now, how can we go about fixing this? Well, it turns out that we can now modify, going to the same location, the etc folder, that host file on our client. So in this case, we will again want to go ahead and run sudo, and I'm going to stick with nano to modify the hosts file. And again, provide the password. And on the client, I want to put, I'm going to go ahead and escape out of that because I'm not sure, I did not mean to make that change. I'm not really sure what happened there. Now, what I can do is I can now add another entry in the host file for 192.168.2.100. And just like on the server host file, I'm going to be very careful here. I'm going to call it server-01.gcm.local. I want to also be able to access it by server-01.gcm, and lastly by server-01. And at this point, if we don't have any typos, we can escape. Yes, do we want to modify it? Yes, the file name is the hosts file. And at this point, then when I ping server-01.gcm.local, well, I do, in fact, get a response from the 2.100. If we can also verify this for the server-01.gcm, you'll notice that I'm no longer pinging that rogue IP address. In other words, whatever service is out there on the web that happen to conflict with my name, but instead I'm getting a reply back from 192.168.2.100. And then lastly, we can simply check to see if I can ping server-01. Now, the last check that we want to make is to go to our web browser. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to simply be able to go to http://server-01.gcm.local. And sure enough, I now see the same web page that I am hosting on my web server. So this is a way of essentially hosting, if you would, some local DNS entries for the purposes of routing traffic on your private network. In other words, in this case, it's sort of for convenience. In other words, you don't have to remember IP addresses. The downside, of course, is that you have to make sure to keep your local hosts file up to date. Now, in later videos, we're going to take a look at how we can actually set up a DNS server on our private network to accomplish the same thing. But you'll notice here that the host file can always be used to essentially override what would otherwise be discovered using DNS. So in other words, if you want to make sure that you are going to a specific resource, you can always modify the host file. And at this point, then whatever I do with the DNS server won't really matter, because it will always be using this entry in the host file to get to my server-01. So as always, I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.